Endemic to New Zealand, the kakapo is a rather interesting bird. Its owl-like face, waddling gait, and forest green colouring make it an odd-looking but nevertheless adorable creature. The kakapo is the only nocturnal flightless parrot in the world, with a current population of 142 adult birds spread across several small islands off the mainland. The kakapo is listed as a threatened species under the nationally critical subcategory. This is the highest category under the system of conservation status used by the New Zealand government. This category is described as being the most severely threatened and facing an immediate high risk of extinction. Fun fact: the kakapo is the heaviest parrot in the world, with females weighing in between 1 and 2.5 kilos and males reaching up to 4 kilos. Unfortunately, the story of the kakapo has been full of ups and downs. These beautiful birds were once abundant across the mainland. The only natural predators these birds had were other predatory birds. However, the kakapo had developed an efficient defense against these hunters who relied on sight. Their mottled green coloring and habit of freezing whenever a predator is nearby allows them to blend seamlessly in with their forested surroundings. Unfortunately, this defense wasn't enough once Maori settlement began, as the new settlers brought Polynesian dogs and rats with them. The Maori people hunted the kakapo for its meat and feathers as it was an abundant species, and the introduced pests began to prey on the bird as they relied on sense of smell for hunting and not sight. When European settlers arrived in the early 1800s, the kakapo had already been driven from much of the mainland, and were now only found in the central North Island and the forested areas of the South Island. The Europeans began to clear the forests and introduced deer and possums who further exhausted the resources the kakapo needed to survive. They also brought with them cats, stoats, and 2 new species of rats that further preyed upon the kakapo. In 1894, the first attempt to save the kakapo was pioneered by conservation ranger Richard Henry, who moved hundreds of the birds to a predator-free island in the Fiordland. Unfortunately, the Resolution Island Sanctuary was lost in the early 1900s as the stoats reached the island and once again began to prey upon the kakapo. For quite a time, the kakapo was believed to be almost extinct, until in 1949 when the recently formed New Zealand Wildlife Service began expeditions to capture the last of the kakapo in Fiordland. After several decades and over 60 expeditions, only 6 kakapo had been found. All were male and all but one died within a few months after capture. In 1974, after all the previously captured birds had died and the kakapo was believed to be extinct, a new series of expeditions began. 18 more kakapo were recovered from Fiordland, including the only mainland bird to successfully pass on his genes to the current population, Richard Henry, named after the conservationist who led the first initiative to protect the kakapo. But, once again, all 18 were male. Then, in 1977, a group of males were heard booming on Stewart Island. This booming is a part of the mating ritual of the kakapo. It's a certain call a male bird makes to attract females from up to several miles away. There were 200 kakapo found on Stewart Island, and eventually in 1980, it was confirmed that there were indeed females on the island. Unfortunately, the feral cats were killing the kakapo, and the population was declining at an alarming rate. Between 1980 and 97, the surviving birds were evacuated to 3 small island sanctuaries, Codfish Island, Maud Island, and Little Barrier Island, yet the population still wasn't rising. Even though it was easier to monitor the birds on the small islands, rats began targeting the eggs and young chicks, and by 1995, even though 12 chicks had successfully hatched, only 3 were still alive. The population was at an all-time low: 51 birds. In 1996, the government-funded National Kakapo Team was formed, and with access to specialist scientific and technological groups, the wild cats, rats, stoats, and possums were successfully eradicated from the 3 islands, and the population finally began to grow once more. In 2005, the Maud Island population was relocated to Anchor Island, as this proved to be a more successful breeding site. Fun fact: because there are so few kakapo, each bird has its own name, and staff can identify almost every bird both by sight and their distinctive personalities. Kakapo are lek breeders. This means that the males put on a show during the breeding season and the females select their mate. After conception, the male has no part in raising the chicks. The bird doesn't breed seasonally or annually like most animals. Instead, they only breed when there is a bumper crop in the fruit of the rimu tree, which is once every 3 to 5 years. Another difficulty in terms of successful breeding is that all new kakapo have descended from the same 51 birds, and of those birds, all but Richard Henry came from the same island. Because of this low level of genetic diversity, the fertility rate in the kakapo is now extremely low. This year, 2019, was a breeding year for the kakapo and has been the most successful year for breeding since rescue efforts began. Unfortunately, during the course of my study, an outbreak of a fungal infection called aspergillosis claimed the lives of 7 birds, both adults and chicks, and with almost 20% of the remaining population currently in veterinary hospitals across the country, this is a major threat for the kakapo. The current population is now 142 adults and 72 chicks. Hopefully no more lives will be lost to this disease. Fun fact: Kakapo are the only lek-breeding parrots in the world. The kakapo once thrived as it perfectly fit into an ecological niche. Before Polynesian settlement, the kakapo were the 3rd most common bird species in New Zealand. The birds were flightless as they had no natural terrestrial predators. They developed a stocky frame and strong beaks and claws to climb trees where they used their wings for balance. Because the kakapo live so long, they mature for several years before they begin to breed. Most of the birds don't breed until they're at least 6 years old. As mentioned before, the birds' colouring and practice of freezing when they sense danger allowed them to avoid predation from other flying birds. Their nocturnal behaviour also helped them to avoid these flying predators, as many of the predatory birds were diurnal. As the kakapo had few natural predators, they adapted to breed only when certain trees were in full bloom. This provided chicks with a constant steady supply of food and ensured that population density didn't reach a critical mass. Kakapo have a keen sense of smell and a distinct odour that is often described as musty sweet. Their odour and developed sense of smell help kakapo to find food and each other in the forest at night. Unfortunately, this odour coupled with the bird's habit of freezing made the kakapo an easy target for introduced predators. And because the kakapo only breed every 3 to 5 years, the population couldn't be rebuilt at a fast enough rate, almost driving the bird to extinction. Fun fact: male kakapo inflate to roughly the size of a football when booming, as it allows their call to carry further. It is important to continue efforts to conserve these birds, not only because they are such a unique species, but also because humans are to blame for the dramatic decline of the kakapo population. You can get involved in the process of bringing this species back from the brink. Kakapo Recovery are the group responsible for monitoring and protecting the birds. You can donate directly to the initiative, volunteer on the islands during breeding seasons, buy merchandise from the shop, or even ceremoniously adopt a kakapo. Current projects include gene sequencing of every living kakapo and the development and use of an artificial insemination drone suitably named the Spermcopter, which was successfully used for the first time this year. These 2 programs are very important as researchers wish to ensure maximum genetic diversity in the future population in the hopes that it will increase the fertility of the population and therefore also increase breeding success. There are several ongoing projects that require frequent funding: the hand-rearing of chicks during breeding season to promote the birds to mate several times, the dietary supplements used to even the numbers of male and female chicks hatched, and of course the ongoing health costs for any sick or injured birds. And now for the last fun fact. The most well-known kakapo and spokesbird for Kakapo Recovery, Sirocco, once tried to mate with zoologist Mark Cardoin's head when he and Stephen Fry visited the birds while filming the 2009 BBC documentary series, Last Chance to See.
A typical male, Sirocco is clearly only interested in one thing.
Hello.
Oh, look at that.
Ow. God, he's got sharp claws.
He's getting a bit frisky.
Ow. Ow.